Today's episode is presented by Mimics, a blend of horror, fun, and romance. From the mind of Christopher Palaha, down on his luck impressionist Sam Reinhold makes a pact with Fergus, a wicked, strings-attached puppet that holds the promise to propel Sam to stardom, unleashing a nightmare that threatens the safety of those he holds dear. Hot off its electrifying premiere at the Cordillera International Film Festival, watch the first trailer at mimicsmovie.com. And don't miss this genre-bending event when it hits theaters on February 6th, 2026. Who's the dummy now?
Warning, the following podcast is not suitable for all audiences. We go into great detail with every case that we cover and do our best to bring viewers even deeper into the stories by utilizing disturbing audio and sound effects.
Trigger warnings from the stories we cover may include violence, rape, murder, and offenses against children.
This podcast is not for everyone. You have been warned.
Our story starts with hundreds of men running towards each other on a battlefield. Each of these men have their own weapons, and their goal is to kill as many people on the other side as possible. The sound of gunfire is going off every other second. Soldiers are dropping to the ground left and right. This battle goes on for quite some time, often until someone surrenders. But in the end, one side will celebrate their victory. However, once the battle is over, there are dead soldiers everywhere. Men who fought for what they believed in. But if you look a bit further than that, you'll see a crowd of people in awe. Some even have their phones out, taking videos of the battle before them. Because in reality, this is not an actual war, but a Civil War reenactment. Every year, hundreds of men get together on these old battlefields, and they will put on performances, replicating what these battles actually looked like back in the day. They will put on their uniforms, either for the Union or Confederacy. They will grab their fake muskets and rifles, and they will march around for the crowd, pretending to kill each other. Now, for the men who sign up to be a part of this, they get to travel the country and escape their reality for a while, stepping into an important time in our country's history. While they are on that battlefield, they're no longer a modern-day citizen, but a soldier who doesn't actually have to kill anyone. They just pretend to. But in the 1980s and 90s, there was a man who participated in these reenactments who did have a thirst for bloodshed. However, his preferred victim wasn't a grown man in uniform. In fact, when the day ended, he took off that uniform and he would go out into the town and hunt for young girls. So this is the story of suspected serial killer Larry Hall. I'm Courtney Browen.
And I'm Colin Browen.
And you're listening to Murder in America.
Nestled in the United States' Midwest is a town called Wabash, Indiana. It's a small town with a small town feel, and it has a lot of history. In fact, Wabash prides itself on being the first electrically lighted city in the world. On March 31st, 1880, 4 3,000 candle-power brush lamps were suspended from the courthouse, and the spectacle drew over 10,000 people to witness it. Now, people have since debated whether or not this claim is accurate, since technically only the courthouse was lit, not the whole town. However, to this day, the people of the city stand proudly by this accomplishment. But if you were to walk down the streets of the historic downtown today, you'd see a line of old brick and limestone buildings that are home to over 100 small businesses. There are restaurants, boutiques, and every week they have a farmer's market. The population of Wabash is around 11,000, and many of the people who were born and raised here grew up to be good, upstanding citizens. After all, people from the Midwest have a reputation of being overly friendly and nice. But on December 11th, 1962, a little boy would be born. His name was Larry Dwayne Hall, and he would grow up to embody the very antithesis of Midwestern values.
Larry Dwayne Hall did not enter this world by himself. In fact, he came here just a few minutes after another little boy named Gary Hall. The two were twins, Gary and Larry, and throughout their lives, you'll see that Gary seemed to have been dealt the upper hand, which was even the case before the two were born. You see, Larry and Gary were monochorionic twins, which meant they shared a placenta, and while in utero, Gary received a greater share of oxygen and nutrients. In fact, it was reported that Gary had, quote, fed on Larry in the womb, end quote. So when the twins were born, Larry had to spend some time in the neonatal intensive care unit, while his brother Gary was doing just fine. But this would seem to mirror what their lives would kind of always look like. Gary would be known as the stronger, more confident of the two, while Larry suffered from health problems and insecurity.
When the twins were born, it wasn't the happiest time for their family. Larry and Gary's mom, Bernice, had had a difficult pregnancy, and their father, Robert, was not financially ready to feed 2 extra mouths. Now, at the time, Robert Hall was working as a gravedigger at Falls Cemetery in Wabash, and the work wasn't easy. He would dig the graves by hand, using picks and shovels. It was reported that it would take him 18 hours to dig one single grave, but Robert was good at what he did. He was a hard worker and did his best to maintain the cemetery. The only problem was it didn't pay very well. So when Robert, who was already in his 40s, found out that his wife, Bernice, was pregnant with twins, he wasn't very excited about the extra expenses that were to come.
Robert Hall was also known to be a heavy drinker with a volatile temper, and as the twins grew up, they were subjected to his abuse. It was later reported that Larry, who was the more shy and sickly of the two, would often just lower his head in fear every time his dad would lash out on him, something author Christopher Hockley Martin described as his submissive pose. In addition, the Hall home, which was located on the cemetery grounds, was not an ideal place for children. As it turns out, Robert and Bernice were hoarders. According to people who knew the family, they had stuff piled up all the way to the ceilings in nearly every room of their house.
One of the boys' best friends, Ross Davis, would tell author James Keene in his novel In with the Devil, quote, "The house was a big place, but it was a dump. It was like a path to walk through. Stuff was piled everywhere. Mrs. Hall was always having a rummage sale, and we used to joke that they lived inside a rummage sale. All the years I knew the family, I never once saw her do any cleaning. They would eat out every day because she was too lazy to cook. That's why they never saved a penny. She was just a big fat lady who sat around the house all day and did nothing but yell and stir up a lot of trouble." End quote.
When the twins reached elementary school, Gary proved himself to be an excellent student. He was intelligent, a hard worker, and he had a lot of friends. But Larry was a completely different story. He really struggled. Not only was his IQ around 80, but he was very antisocial and anxious, and he had a hard time making friends. He also had a speech impediment. So while his twin brother Gary was considered popular, Larry was picked on. Kids would call him stupid and worthless, and he was known around school as the, quote, stinky kid. And sadly, his life at home wasn't much easier. You see, Larry struggled with bedwetting, something that followed him into his preteen years. According to his family, he would have these nightmares, and when he would wake up from them, he would find himself soiled in his own urine. And instead of getting help, his parents punished him anytime it happened. Now, their father, Robert Hall, was very strict, but so was their mother, Bernice. She was known to be just as ruthless as her husband. So Larry Hall didn't really have a safe space. His home life wasn't easy, school was difficult, and he didn't have any friends aside from his brother. In fact, throughout his life, His twin brother Gary was really the only person he could rely on. Now, growing up, Larry and Gary spent a lot of their childhood in the graveyard. That was their playground. They would play hide and seek, hiding behind tombstones, and they would watch their father spend hours digging up graves for people in their community. In the winter, the boys would sled down the embankment in their backyard, and in the summer they would catch minnows in the nearby creek. They were two Midwestern boys with big imaginations. Now, their father would always tell them that they were part Native American, and they were always very interested in their heritage. When they would run around outside, they would look for arrowheads, and they would transport themselves back in time, pretending that the cemetery was their village and that they were Native American war chiefs. These times were arguably some of the best of Larry's childhood. He loved to play pretend, to put himself in a time period hundreds of years back and take on the role of someone else, which is a hobby that he would carry on into his adulthood.
Now, like we mentioned, Larry did really poorly in school. By the time he was in junior high, he was still reading below a 6th grade level. With his low IQ, it was difficult for him to grasp the curriculum, but the one subject he always did really well in was history. He loved hearing the stories of all the different wars, especially the United States Civil War. But other than that, he really struggled in school, and it was still hard for him to make friends. By the time he was hitting puberty, Larry was described as short, chubby, and he had a lot of acne, something that kids would make fun of him for. It was reported that he would often walk through the halls with his head down. However, on the other hand, his brother Gary was thriving. Gary had a big friend group. He was popular, outgoing, and he was involved in school sports. So the two brothers couldn't have been more different from one another. Larry often compared himself to his twin brother. He wanted to be more like him, but he didn't know how, which only led Larry to have even more insecurities.
When the twins reached high school, Larry watched as his brother was able to smoothly talk to women. Gary had no problems getting girlfriends, but no girls ever seemed to be interested in Larry, which was frustrating for him. He wanted a girlfriend, but they didn't want him. In fact, Larry would later say that girls would often laugh at him, something that ignited a rage within him, something that angered him to his core. And it's around this time when Larry started channeling this rejection into something sinister. He began stalking girls at his high school. Larry would drive around town for hours looking for girls, and he had a type. He liked athletic girls with shoulder-length brown hair. When he would find one that he was sexually attracted to, he would secretly follow her while fantasizing about what he wanted to do with her. But during these stalking moments, he was also faced with an infuriating reality. As much as he wanted these girls, he knew that they would never want him back. So all of these sexual fantasies were just that, fantasies, and they would never be anything more.
At age 15, Larry and Gary started to get into some trouble. That year, they were actually arrested for breaking a storefront window in downtown Wabash. Once the boys were taken to the station, they sat down with Detective Ron Smith, and apparently Larry confessed that he was the one who broke the window. From there, Robert and Bernice were forced to pay the damage, a total of $500, and Robert made Larry mow the cemetery lawn to pay it back. But this was only the beginning of a set of petty crimes Larry would be responsible for. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, several mysterious fires were set around Wabash, including fires at a lumberyard, a bridge, and a few buildings. Now, they were never able to catch the arsonist, but they always suspected it was the Hall twins. And later on, Larry would later admit that he was responsible for the fires. And by this point, he had admitted to and committed two specific behaviors that are often seen in budding serial killers: bedwetting and setting fires.
By the age of 18, Larry was well on his way to becoming a criminal. He was a burglar, vandal, and arsonist, but he was still able to graduate from high school in 1981. However, things were really difficult for the Hall family around this time. Robert Hall, their father, had actually been fired from his grave-digging position after working there for decades. Apparently, Robert's alcoholism had gotten really bad, so much so it started to affect his job. It was reported that he even put people in the wrong graves on several occasions. So from there, Robert was fired, and their family was forced to move out of their home. Now, by this point, Gary was actually doing really well for himself. After graduation, he moved out of his parents' house, got a good paying job, and he even had a serious girlfriend. But Larry was still struggling. After his twin brother moved out, he was now living with his parents all by himself, enduring the brunt of his father's abuse. Larry also didn't really know what he wanted to do with his life, so he ended up finding work as a janitor, cleaning for various businesses around town, but he was still feeling unfulfilled. However, something that brought a little excitement into his life was car shows. He had been known to travel around the Midwest visiting these shows in the early 80s, and it's believed that during one of these car shows, he participated in another hobby of his, stalking women. Now, the case we are about to mention is of 19-year-old Naomi Lee Kidder, who went missing in Buffalo, Wyoming in June of 1982. At the time, Larry Hall would have been just 19 years old, but some people suspect him of Naomi's murder, and that's because years down the road, when investigators would search through Larry's things, they found a notebook of his, and as they flipped through the pages, there was her name, Naomi Lee Kidder. Now, Naomi went missing in Wyoming, which is pretty far away from Indiana, but it's believed that Larry was possibly visiting a car show over there when he decided to take a drive through town. It was June 28, 1982. Naomi had just left her home in Buffalo to go on a road trip with some friends. Eventually, the group ended up about 150 miles away in the town of Rollins. That night, they decided to pull over and stay at a Travel Lodge hotel. However, by that next morning, Naomi told her friends to go on without her. Now, the details around this are still a little unclear, but for whatever reason, Naomi decided that she was going to hitchhike. However, she would never make it. For the next few months, no one had seen or heard from her. That is until September 10th, 1982.
That day, out in a rural area of Natrona County, Wyoming, a nude body of a woman was found in a shallow grave. Horrifically, she had barbed wire knotted around her neck that indicated the cause of death was strangulation. But because she was in such an advanced state of decomposition, she wouldn't be identified for years. Meanwhile, Naomi's mother frantically searched for information on her daughter's whereabouts. It wouldn't be until February of 1993 when the dental records were entered into the National Crime Information Center database that investigators were able to identify the remains. They belonged to Naomi Lee Kidder. Now, sadly, Naomi's murder is still unsolved, but like we mentioned, her name was found written in Larry Hall's notebook in 1994, just 1 year after her body had been identified. He never confessed to her murder, but some people out there believe that he is responsible and that Naomi was his first victim.
The next case took place in Somerville, Illinois in 1986. This would have been 4 years after Naomi's murder, and Larry Hall would have been around 24 years old. But unlike the previous murder, where the victim's name was written in his notebook, Larry actually confessed to this one. He said that he had been driving around Illinois, likely traveling from one of those car shows, when he noticed a young woman on the side of the road. She was hitchhiking, and Larry decided to pull over. The woman in question was 26-year-old Eulalia Malia Chavez, who went by the name Lolly. Now, Lolly was originally from Costa Rica, and she had been adopted by a family in California. At some point in the mid-70s, Lolly became estranged from her adoptive family, and over the years, she was known to hitchhike across the country. However, this time, it's suspected that she got into the car of a killer, someone who might have been Larry Hall. Now, what exactly transpired next, we don't know, but we do know that Lolly was met with a horrific death. She had been sexually mutilated and strangled with a piece of her own clothing. Then following her death, her body was mutilated. Her killer even tried to remove her reproductive organs post-mortem. On September 6, 1986, Lolly's nude body was discovered in a cornfield near Somerville, Illinois. And when investigators saw the damage, they knew they were dealing with a monster. But sadly, Lolly's body would go unidentified for decades. During that time, she was simply known as the Somerville Jane Doe. For years, Autopsy photographs and sketches were used in newspapers to help identify her, but unfortunately no one knew who she was. However, in 2007, the Summerfield Jane Doe was exhumed and her DNA was extracted. Shockingly, they discovered a match. As it turns out, Lolly had a prior misdemeanor arrest under an alias she used, Folia Chavez, and that's how they learned of her identity. Now, there are people who believe Larry Hall was responsible for Lolly's death, but there are also people who don't. You see, a year after Lolly was identified, Larry Hall, who had been arrested by that point, wrote a letter to a television reporter confessing to her murder. He even gave specific details about how he picked her up while she was hitchhiking. However, when detectives ultimately questioned him, he denied any involvement. Now, there was DNA from the crime scene that was tested against Larry's, but the results were inconclusive, meaning that it could neither be confirmed or denied. And as of today, Lolly's murder remains unsolved.
If Larry was responsible for the deaths of Naomi Kidder and Lolly Chavez, then that means he spent a lot of time prowling. Like we mentioned, he would usually travel around for these car shows, so he had all of these towns to drive through. New areas, new women to stalk, and most importantly, because he was from out of town, no one would ever suspect him. But at this time in Larry's life, he was very unhappy. He was still living with his parents in their one-bedroom home, having to sleep in their living room. And he was still close to his brother Gary, but he had moved out and had his own life. So anytime Larry had the opportunity to get away for a weekend, he would take it. And it's around this time when he discovered Civil War reenactments. He first learned about them after hearing about them on a television program. At these reenactments, men would travel to the battlefields and reenact famous battles from the Civil War. Now, like we mentioned before, throughout his entire life, Larry had always loved history. So he decided to go to one himself. In December of 1986, Larry made the 3-hour drive to Champaign, Illinois, where they were doing one of these reenactments, which also happened to be the exact same time and place where 25-year-old Kimberly Ann Thompson went missing. It was December 1st of that year, and Kimberly's father had just dropped her off near her boyfriend's house. However, it seemed as though Kimberly never made it inside, because right after her father drove away that day, no one would ever see or hear from her again. Now, interestingly, a few months before her disappearance, she had actually testified against 2 men in a drug trafficking case, and her testimony landed the men in prison for 7 years. So there were people out there who weren't too happy with her. The police even offered her protection and money for her to relocate, but she refused, stating she wasn't ready to leave the area. Kimberly had also come into some money, roughly $25,000 to $35,000, after she filed a workplace injury lawsuit, but unfortunately, she never arrived to collect the cash, leading everybody to believe she was dead. Now, like we mentioned, her name is often associated with Larry Hall because he was in the area at the time of her disappearance, but he's never officially been linked to her case, and sadly, her body has never been found, so her case is still unsolved.
The following year, in 1987, a 10-year-old girl named Linda Lynn Weldy disappeared after getting off her school bus in LaPorte, Indiana. Described by her mother Karen as a joyful and funny girl with a good sense of humor, Linda loved being outdoors. She was a 5th grader at her elementary school, and she was extremely close to her family. But on that February afternoon, Linda vanished. Now that night, when her mom got home from work, she saw that her son and boyfriend were home, but Linda was gone. The guys had just assumed that she had went over to a friend's house, but Karen knew that something was wrong, so she called the police. But sadly, by then, Linda had already been missing for over 7 hours. When the police showed up, there were no signs of a struggle where Linda had been dropped off. There were no eyewitnesses that saw her being abducted. Her bus driver even said that there weren't any suspicious vehicles around either. And sadly, for weeks, there were no leads in the case. That is until March 17, 1987, when a farmer near Kingsbury had been clearing out a piece of land when he stumbled upon the decomposing body of Linda Weldy. She was found near an abandoned railroad track, and it was clear she had been manually strangled. Now, she did have her clothes on, but due to the state of decomposition, they were not able to tell whether or not she had been sexually assaulted, but they did see that she had put up a fight. When her body was discovered in the tall weeds, Linda was still clutching the grass in her fists. And unfortunately, no one was ever charged with her murder. But years down the road after Larry Hall's arrest, he was looked into as a person of interest. And he even confessed to Linda's murder, but later recanted it. Larry also happened to be in the area at the time of Linda's disappearance, but they eventually came to the conclusion that he was not responsible. At least, they didn't have enough evidence to prove it was him. And to this day, Linda's case is unsolved.
Hey everybody, Courtney and I have a favor to ask of you. If you love Murder in America, you love our show, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you love our show and you want to help us grow, definitely consider leaving us a 5-star review. Also, it helps the show so much when people share out links to our program. So if you're listening and you're loving what we're doing here, share us on your Instagram story, shout us out on X, post one of our shows on your Facebook, and let the world, your friends, your family know that you're listening to Murder in America. It seriously helps us so much. It helps us grow the show. We couldn't do this without all of you listening at home. Seriously, thank y'all. But let's get back to the story. Now, at this point, Larry loved these Civil War reenactments so much, he decided that he wanted to become a part of them. So, in 1988, he decided to join a group of men who portrayed the 19th Indiana Volunteer Infantry Regiment, also known as the Union's Iron Brigade. For Larry, he couldn't think of anything more perfect for him. Not only would he get to do something he loved, but he would also get to escape his home life while he was on the road. So, for months, he and his group traveled around the Midwest and participated in reenactments, and his brother Gary actually joined him. The twins had always had very similar interests while growing up, and history was one of them. So it was something they did together, and they loved it. On the weekends, Larry, Gary, and the rest of the Iron Brigade would camp out near the battlegrounds, and when the crowds would show up to watch, they would run out into the fields wearing full Civil War attire, including hardy hats, wool coats, and dark blue pants. And over the weekend, they would shoot their muskets and rifles, march alongside each other, and pretend to kill Confederate soldiers. It was the perfect hobby for Larry Hall. He got to spend time with his brother, doing what he loved.
After spending their weekends traveling around with the Iron Brigade, the Hall twins were well known within the group. But like always, people seemed to prefer Gary Hall over his quiet and introverted twin brother, Larry. People that worked with them said that Larry was never one to strike up a conversation. He was so shy, they even gave him the nickname Laid-Back Larry. Now, something else these men noticed about Larry was that he always drove to these reenactments in his van, and this job brought them to towns all over the Midwest. When they were done with their work for the day, Larry was known to get into his van and go explore whatever town they were in. But when he would take these drives, he always avoided the interstates. He preferred the long country roads that took you through the rural neighborhoods. Every time he would leave to go take these drives, his co-workers always assumed that he was just the kind of guy that preferred peace and quiet, someone who loved long drives all by himself. But in reality, Laid-Back Larry wasn't at all who they thought he was. As it turns out, Larry Hall would use this opportunity to drive around these towns and look for women. And just like he did in high school, when he would find someone he was attracted to, he would stalk them. At times, Larry would follow these women around for days, and he would make notes about them in his journal. He would write down the area where young women frequented. He would write down the supplies he needed to abduct them. And eventually, after following a victim around for days, he would find a moment where they were finally alone. Using his van, Larry would pull up beside these girls and abduct them. He would usually use a knife to intimidate them, saying if they just followed instructions, they would make it out alive. But that was always an empty promise, because once these girls were inside of his van, Larry knew that they would never be leaving. And the horrors that took place inside of that van were unimaginable. Larry would tie these women up and rape them. Then when he was finished with the assault, he would kill them by either stabbing or strangulation. After the murders, he would discard their bodies in remote parts of town. Some of his victims would end up being found. Others are still missing to this day. But at the time, because he was from out of town, investigators in the area would never have Larry on their radar.
Larry Hall's next suspected murder took place on September 2, 1988. 19-year-old Paulette Webster had disappeared near Chester, Illinois. She had just left her friend's house after an evening of bowling and was never seen again. At first, investigators believed that Paulette left the area on her own accord. However, she took no personal belongings with her. Her clothes, purse, and driver's license were all found in her bedroom. And sadly, Paulette was never seen again. Now, Larry Hall would later say that he couldn't remember if he was responsible for her murder, but said, quote, "If I did it, I would have put her in a river or in a field," end quote. On September 20th, 1988, 16-year-old Cynthia Louise Carmack disappeared near the Fort Hamilton Historic Site in Hamilton, Ohio. The brown-haired, blue-eyed teenager was last seen leaving a shopping center in the 1000 block of Parkamo Avenue. Unfortunately, she was never seen again, and her case remains unsolved. On December 16th, 1988, an unidentified white female, only known as Jane Doe, was discovered on the east side of the northbound lane of Interstate 59, only 5 miles from the Georgia-Alabama state line. Investigators theorized that the female was 20 to 25 years old. She had brown hair and blue eyes. She had been sexually mutilated and strangled to death. The body was discovered close to Civil War battle sites, including Dalton, Chickamauga, and Adairsville. Today, her remains have never been identified, and the case still remains unsolved.
By 1989, Civil War reenactments had become a huge part of Larry's life. In fact, that year, he and his twin brother Gary had been invited to be extras in a Civil War movie called Glory, and this was a big opportunity for them. That weekend, the twins loaded up Larry's van and started to make the drive to the movie set in Atlanta, Georgia. Along with them was their friend Michael Thompson. Now, along the way, Gary reached down into his seat when he felt something at the tip of his fingers. It was a fabric of some sort. When he pulled it up, Gary was shocked to see a pair of women's underwear. Now, for the first time in their 27 years of life, Larry had never had a girlfriend. In fact, he had barely even talked to girls. So as you can imagine, seeing these underwear in his car was surprising. But when he asked Larry about them, he brushed it off. Larry even laughed, saying, "You must have planted those there." Sitting in the back seat, their friend Michael Thompson would later say that upon hearing this conversation, he couldn't help but think that something felt off. Maybe it was the look on Larry's face when the underwear were pulled out, a look as though he had just been caught doing something bad. Now, Michael was closer to Gary than he was Larry. Larry was quiet and kept to himself, but every once in a while, he would have these moments of rage, especially when things didn't go his way. Michael said that one time Larry found a scratch on his Civil War rifle, and in that moment he turned into an entirely different person, screaming in anger. All of these men knew that Larry could be unpredictable. They also knew that he would often take his van and drive through these small rural towns for hours on end. No one ever knew where he was or what he was doing. Most of the guys just assumed he was hiring sex workers. However, Larry spent his free time doing something much, much darker. And unbeknownst to law enforcement, nearly every time Larry Hall drove through these towns, young women were going missing.
On June 26, 1989, 26-year-old Lynn Ann Thompson's abandoned car was found in a Kmart parking lot in Terre Haute, Indiana. She was never seen or heard from again, and her case remains unsolved. The area of her disappearance was south of 2 reenactment sites that Larry frequented, Billy Creek Village and Turkey Run State Park. On October 1st, 1989, 28-year-old Janet Rose Dolge disappeared from her residence at the 500 block of Portage Easterly Road in Cortland, Ohio. She was on her way to work at a local restaurant where she was a hostess, dressed in her work shirt and dress pants. Unfortunately, Janet was never seen again, and her case remains unsolved. On July 20th, 1990, an unidentified white female was found in a bean field in Jarvis Township, Illinois. The woman was around 25 years old and had shoulder-length auburn hair. She had several stab wounds to her neck and torso, and she had been sexually mutilated. The killer had removed her reproductive organs. Unfortunately, the woman has never been identified and is known only today as Jane Doe. Her case remains unsolved. Investigators later looked into Larry Hall as being their killer, but without sufficient evidence, they couldn't prove it.
On July 1st, 1991, Larry Hall was in Indianapolis, Indiana. He had driven there to look at a 1982 blue Dodge van that he was interested in, but he also decided to use his time to drive around looking for young women, and according to Larry, he would eventually find one. That afternoon, 20-year-old Michelle Dewey was outside her apartment complex sunbathing with her infant son Will. It was a beautiful day out, but unbeknownst to Michelle, a man had been watching her for hours. Eventually, she would go inside her apartment to put her son down for a nap, and according to Larry, that's when he decided to go in for the attack, barging into Michelle's apartment with a knife. And it's here where a struggle ensued. Michelle ran around her apartment trying to escape him, but eventually, he got her, and on the floor of her apartment, she was strangled and stabbed to death. Now later that night, Michelle actually had plans, so she had hired a babysitter, but when that babysitter showed up to her apartment, she had no idea what she was about to walk into. As soon as she stepped inside, there was blood everywhere, so she immediately called Michelle's father and the police. Soon after, investigators would find Michelle Dewey's body, and hidden within a closet, they found her son Will unharmed. Now we don't know if Michelle put him in there to protect him against the killer, or if the killer put him there himself. And sadly, like many of the others, Michelle's case would go unsolved. But years later, Larry Hall would confess to the crime. He said that he saw Michelle and her son out by the pool that day, and he knew right then that he wanted to have her. So when she went inside of her apartment, he followed her. However, things did not go as planned. According to Larry, during the attack, Michelle's son Will started screaming. Larry said it, quote, freaked him out. So in that moment, he left the scene in a hurry, but he made sure to grab one souvenir, a record album. Now, like I said, Larry did confess to this crime, but he would eventually recant that confession. And today, the Indianapolis police continue to investigate his involvement in Michelle's murder, but the case remains unsolved.
A few weeks after Michelle's murder on July 25, 1991, 37-year-old Georgia Ann Shreve disappeared after last being seen at a truck stop in Clermont on the west side of Indianapolis. On August 5th, her body was discovered in a ditch next to the westbound ramp of Interstate 74 at Indiana State Route 25. In Larry's 1994 confession, he admitted that he had picked up a woman in Clermont, something he vividly remembered because the woman didn't want to go with him. He forced the woman into the car, although he could not remember her name. And as of today, the case remains unsolved. In March of 1992, the body of a Jane Doe was located in Fulton County, Georgia. Then a few months later, on June 3, 1992, another Jane Doe was discovered in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Larry Hall is suspected in both Jane Doe murders. But 1992 was another busy year for Larry and his Civil War reenactments. By that point, he was so invested in the role, he had even grown his sideburns out so that he would look more like the soldiers at the time. That summer, he and his brother had been cast as extras in another Civil War movie called Gettysburg. Now, Larry was never seen in the film, but interestingly, his brother was. If you were to watch the movie, you'd actually see Gary Hall as he ran down a hill in one of the scenes. He'd later tell the Chronicle Tribune for Marion, Indiana, quote, "It was actually my first reenactment combat. I learned a lot, but it was also dangerous. They had a stuntman in front of me during one scene. He was blown 6 feet into the air by an explosion. It was planned, but even that seemed dangerous."
After the filming of Gettysburg, Larry Hall found himself in Menasha, Wisconsin, in August of 1992. And as he was driving around town, he was on the lookout for a beautiful young woman he could attack. And eventually, it's suspected that he crossed paths with 20-year-old Lori Jean Deppes. That evening, Lori had just finished a shift at the graffiti store gift shop near US 41. After leaving the store, She started walking towards her 1984 Volkswagen. It was around 10 p.m., so the parking lot was mostly empty, except for Larry Hall's van. After spotting Lori, it's suspected that Larry followed her, and he ended up following her all the way over to her boyfriend's apartment. Now, according to Larry, he had actually met her earlier that day at the mall, and he asked her out. But Lori respectfully declined. She said that she was meeting up with some friends after work, so she wouldn't be able to hang out with him. However, for that entire day, Larry continued following Lori. He said that when she left work that night, he was in his van, waiting for her, and as she drove to her boyfriend's apartment, he was following close behind. Once she arrived, Lori got out of her car and began to grab her stuff, and it's here where Larry said he approached her and asked if she wanted to look at a photo album of vintage cars. Now, Larry said that Lori willingly got into his van to look at the pictures, but anyone hearing this story knows that that isn't true. If Larry had already approached her at the mall that day, then she would have known that he was following her, and she definitely would have been scared. But according to Larry, once she got into the van, he injected her with an animal tranquilizer, something he said he got from a friend. Then, once she was unconscious, he sped out of the parking lot and found a remote area to rape and murder her. He then disposed of her body in a wooded area. Now, disturbingly, earlier that night, Lori's boyfriend said that he actually heard her car pull up to his apartment. She apparently had this loud muffler, so he knew that she had arrived. After hearing her car shut off, he was expecting her to walk through the door at any moment, but several minutes would pass with nothing. So from there, he decided to go outside. And just like he expected, there was Lori's Volkswagen in the parking lot, but there was no sign of Lori. Now, at first, he thought this was some kind of prank she was playing. He even jokingly yelled out, come out wherever you are," but Lori didn't come out. And eerily enough, her car was locked with her overnight bag still inside. Then on top of her car roof was a styrofoam cup of soda with the ice still melting. So from here, her boyfriend decided to call the police.
After her disappearance, investigators theorized that perhaps Lori had run off with someone she knew, but her loved ones couldn't stop thinking about that cup of soda in her car, and the fact that she left her overnight bag inside her vehicle. Lori didn't run away. Someone had hurt her. But for months, Lori remained missing. Following her disappearance, hundreds of volunteers searched alongside investigators. Thousands of missing persons flyers were distributed throughout surrounding areas. Civil Air Patrol helicopters looked for clues by air, but there was absolutely nothing to be found. Unfortunately, Lori was never seen again, and her case remains unsolved to this day. In Larry's 1994 confession, he admitted he had traveled to Wisconsin several days before Lori's disappearance for a Civil War reenactment at Gringen Mansion in Kaukauna. Shockingly, her name was also mentioned in his diary that was discovered in his van after he was arrested. Larry ultimately confessed to her murder in November of 2010, but to this day, she's never been found.
In March of 1993, Larry Hall was in Indiana, and he decided to drive his van to Indiana Wesleyan University. Colleges were Larry's favorite places to visit. They were full of young and unsuspecting women, who were often walking around campus at all hours of the day. And on this day in particular, he parked his van near Marsh's grocery store. The store happened to be right next to campus, so there were a ton of college women going in and out of the store for hours on end. Larry had parked his van in the parking lot and watched as each woman walked out the door. There were many that he was attracted to, but none that he found worthy enough to kill. He was specifically looking for girls with short brown hair, but as he sat in his van, he pulled out his notebook and wrote down the following.
Seen many nice girls at Marsh's. Lots of walkers at 715. Walking to apartments on Nebraska in 4443. Must be housing for the university. Seen some prospects. Look at maps. Get the van ready.
Get the van ready. You see, Larry's van wasn't just a way for him to travel around the country. In fact, it was packed full of everything he needed to abduct and murder women. In the back, he had tarps, knives, ropes, hacksaws, shovels, cleaning products, starter fluid, rags, binoculars, and duct tape. Over the years, he had perfected his craft. He had learned how to kidnap, how to murder, and how to dispose of his victims' bodies. With every kill, he added onto his list so that his van was packed with everything he would ever need. And on this weekend, as he was looking for his next victim, he would eventually see 19-year-old Trisha Lynn Reitler. Trisha had walked past Larry's van, having no idea that eyes were watching her. And as soon as Larry saw her, he knew that she was the one. Disturbingly, over the next few days, Larry studied Trisha's every move. And finally, on the evening of March 29, 1993, he decided it was time to attack.
Trisha was a freshman at Indiana Wesleyan University studying psychology, and everyone who knew her described her as extremely smart, energetic, athletic, and determined. She had grown up in Olmsted Falls, Ohio, in a happy home. Her father, Gary, owned a woodworking business, and her mother, Donna, cleaned homes. The Reitlers were devoted to their faith and attended Golden Harvest Church in Columbia Station, Ohio. Growing up, Trisha was active in the youth group and sang in the church choir. She was extremely close with her parents and 3 younger siblings. When looking for colleges, Trisha wanted a religious-affiliated school and agreed upon Indiana Wesleyan when her application was accepted. By all accounts, Trisha excelled in college. She maintained good grades, earning her a spot on the dean's list, and worked part-time at the University Food Center on campus. She knew she wanted to focus her attention on helping people and decided to major in psychology. She was petite, vibrant, and loved poetry, journaling, and helping others.
Trisha had had a busy week full of exams and writing papers. College can definitely be stressful and overwhelming, but something that always helped her relieve her stress was going on daily jogs. Trisha loved it, but lately on her jogs, she noticed a mysterious van following in the distance. Trisha was so concerned, she even told her roommate that she believed she was being stalked. She said that this van would slowly drive behind her for a little, and then eventually turn off on a side street. And something deep down within her told her that something was wrong, but she truly had no idea what was ahead. On March 29, 1993, Trisha had spent the entire day writing a college paper. And finally that evening, she decided to take a break and treat herself to a root beer at Marsh's grocery store. However, little did Trisha know, Larry Hall was waiting for her. He ended up parking near this park near her dorm. After days of watching her, he knew that she would have to walk through this park to get back to her apartment. So he sat and waited. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., Trisha came out of Marsh's grocery store with her root beer, and she started the walk back home. According to Larry, he watched in anticipation, waiting for the perfect time to strike. As soon as she started walking through the park, he put his van in drive and drove over to her. Now, as you can imagine, after seeing this van following her on her jogs, Trisha must have been terrified when she saw it coming. According to Larry, she even screamed and tried to run away, but he quickly jumped out of his van and tackled her. Using a knife to intimidate her, he told Trisha to calm down and she wouldn't get hurt. But that was a lie. While pressing the knife against her skin, he ordered her to undress. Trisha obeyed and removed her shirt, shoes, and pants. She knew what was about to come next, so in an effort to protect herself, Trisha tried to run, but Larry was faster. He eventually caught up and punched her in the face until she was unconscious. He then grabbed her and threw her into the back of his van. According to Larry, he already had a tarp laid out for this exact moment. He knew what he was doing, and he didn't want to get her DNA in his van. He also had these wooden beams in his van, and connected to the beams were these straps. Investigators believe that he would use them to restrain women in the back of the van while he drove to a secluded location, which is likely what happened with Trisha. After securing her, Larry got into the driver's seat and drove around town. That park where he had attacked her had too many people around. He needed to find a more remote area, and finally, he found one. Larry said that it's here where he pulled over and he raped her. Once Larry was finished with the assault, he would kill her like he killed his other victims. Now, in the back of his van was his Civil War uniform, which included 2 belts. Larry said that he interlocked the belts, placed Trisha up against a tree, and then put the belt around her neck. Larry then stood behind the tree, holding one end of the belt in each of his hands. He then used his body to pull against it for several minutes until he felt Trisha go limp. Once she was dead, he said he concealed her body and fled the area like he always did. But in his journal, he made some notes for himself. After Trisha's murder, he wrote the following.
Replace rear carpet and van. Cut out stained carpet. Vacuum van thoroughly. Spray down chemicals. Wiped with Armor All. Burnt paint and tarps. Buy new hacksaw blades. Clean all tools with denatured alcohol. Take tires off and clean mud from under fenders.
Over the next few days, Trisha's roommates started to grow concerned when they couldn't find her. So finally, on the morning of March 31st, they called the police. They also told them about how Trisha thought she was being stalked in the days before her disappearance. And as you can imagine, when people on campus heard that a young girl had gone missing, everyone was terrified. Female students grew concerned for their own safety. No one wanted to walk alone at night, but the community really came together to help investigators in the search. Over the next few weeks, hundreds of volunteers helped search the 220-acre campus. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched the nearby marshes and lakes. Volunteers were on horsebacks, and some were even using their own boats to search the waters. But their search was coming up empty. However, they would end up searching that field in between Marsh's grocery store and Trisha's dorm, and that's when they found her clothing and shoes. In fact, the shoes belonged to Trisha's mother, Donna. She had given them to Trisha shortly before she left for college because she loved them so much. Now, apparently, one of the items of clothing had small amounts of blood on it, but after searching the nearby areas, there was still no sign of Trisha. After a week, it seemed as though they had searched everywhere, including abandoned rail cars, isolated fields, dumpsters, ditches, and even trash cans lined out on the streets. Thousands of missing persons flyers were distributed, with a reward of $10,000 for her whereabouts. But unfortunately, weeks and weeks would pass with no trace of her, which is horrifically where the case still stands today. Trisha Reitler's body has never been located. Anyone with any information is still encouraged to call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS.
Here she is. It's
a 30-year journey.
We can come up with a body. We really don't have a case.
30 years later, that sentiment from police still holds true.
I would tell myself I could do this for one more day. I could do this for one more day. You know, I can get through one more day. Never, ever imagining 30 years later we would still be here.
You have to put it into perspective or it will wear you down. It will destroy you in time.
But here's the thing about time. It never stops ticking.
As time passes by, the hope that we will ever find her begins to dwindle.
And then there's times, like just the other morning, where it was hard to remember her.
A memorial is now in place at Indiana Westlane's campus. Trisha's parents tell me when they're in town, they come and pay it a visit. In Marion, Caitlin Kendall, WRTV.
Now, in the weeks after Trisha's disappearance, the women on campus were on edge. Even though investigators hadn't found her body, Trisha's clothes being abandoned in that field told them everything that they needed to know, that someone had likely raped and killed her. So women made sure to walk around campus with their friends. After all, there's safety in numbers, right? But unbeknownst to everyone, just 1 week after Trisha's disappearance, her killer was back on campus to find yet another victim. It was April 6, 1993. 19-year-old Christian Zoller and her roommate, 20-year-old Heather Edgett, decided to walk together to Marsh's grocery store to pick up a few items. The same grocery store where Larry Hall spotted Trisha. And on this day, He had his eyes set on his next potential victims, Christian and Heather. As the girls walked back to campus, they suddenly noticed his mysterious van following them close behind. Christian would later tell police that the van got so close, she could have reached out and touched it. But remembering what happened to Trisha Reitler, the girls quickly bolted across the field, running as fast as they could as the driver yelled out something behind them. The girls immediately called campus security, and they gave a description of the man. The thing that stuck out the most was his mutton chop sideburns.
Campus security guard Dale Beck received the phone call, and as he heard the description, the Dodge van actually drove right past him. Now, Dale was a veteran officer with the Grant County Sheriff's Department, and he decided to pull the van over himself. The driver handed his license over, and Dale saw the name, Larry Hall. Now, when asked if Larry was following these girls, he made up an elaborate story about trying to locate a friend's house. He even gave Dale the address of the home. And to Dale, his story sounded truthful. This wasn't a guy trying to abduct these women, he simply needed directions. So from here, Larry was allowed to leave, which is unfortunate, because little did they know, their killer had been right in front of them, and Larry Hall would go on to kill again months later.
On September 19, 1993, Larry attended a Revolutionary War reenactment at Forest Glen Park in Woodridge, Illinois. For hours, he and his men marched around that field shooting at soldiers. But as the battle for the day ended, Larry Hall was itching for a different kind of violence, a real one. So he took off his uniform, got into his van, and he started driving around the city of Woodbridge. Around that time, 15-year-old Jessica Lynn Roach was riding her mountain bike home from school in the nearby city of Georgetown, Illinois. The bike had been a gift from her parents, and she absolutely loved it. That day, when Jessica finally got closer to her house, her older sister Mindy actually drove past her. She was leaving home to go run some errands. But little did she know this would be the very last time she would ever see her sister alive. Because just down the road was Larry Hall. Larry had spotted Jessica on her bike and immediately pulled over to talk to her. But Jessica was scared, even more so when Larry got out and approached her. On the side of that desolate road, with no one around, he pushed Jessica into his van. He then sped off with no one seeing a thing. Now, about an hour later, Jessica's sister Mindy would come back home after running those errands. But along the way, she saw something that made her stomach drop. It was Jessica's bike in the middle of the road, abandoned. Mindy immediately stopped the car and started yelling out her sister's name. She even started honking her horn in hopes that Jessica would hear her, but there was no sign of her little sister. After moving her bike out of the road, Mindy rushed back home and burst through her family's front door. "Have you seen Jessica?" she asked her brother Chris, but he hadn't. Mindy then ran to her parents' room where her dad Lauren was taking a nap. After waking him up, she told him the horrific news, that Jessica was missing and that her bike was found in the middle of the road. So from here, Lauren immediately called the police. When they finally made their way to the scene, they saw Jessica's bike. They also saw what appeared to be a small disturbance in the gravel next to her bike. But this is a safe town, a town where you can rely on your neighbors. So at first, everyone was thinking that maybe someone had hit Jessica with their car and brought her to the hospital. However, after checking the local hospitals, there was still no sign of her.
And believe it or not, investigators even suggested that maybe Jessica ran away, which is wild considering that her bike was found in the middle of the road. But luckily, they soon dropped that theory, because as it turned out, Jessica wasn't the only young girl who had gone missing around that time. In fact, many young girls in Illinois and Indiana had been vanishing. So that night, investigators and volunteers began their searches. They combed the cornfields, abandoned buildings, barns, ponds, marshes, rivers, lakes, and wooded areas. But there was no sign of Jessica, and her family was worried sick.
Days and days would pass without finding her. And even though her family knew she hadn't run away, I'm sure part of them hoped that maybe she did. That soon enough she'd come walking through the door, and that they could all laugh about this one day. but deep down they knew that that wasn't the case. And with each passing day, the chances of her coming home were growing slimmer. Now, investigators had taken her bike to the state police crime lab in Springfield, but unfortunately, there were no fingerprints, no blood, no fibers. There was absolutely nothing that could point them to someone who would have hurt her. Then on October 5th, America's Most Wanted aired a segment about Jessica Roach. However, none of the tips that came in led to her whereabouts. But it wouldn't be long until they would find her. It was November 8th, 1993. A farmer in Perrysville, Indiana, was harvesting a cornfield when he saw a disturbance up ahead. At first, he thought it was a deer carcass, so he hopped off his machine to take a closer look. However, as he walked up, he immediately knew that this was no animal. It was a human, a young female who was nude and, disturbingly, she had been decapitated, with her head lying a few feet away from her body. Horrified, the farmer immediately went to call 911. Now, keep in mind, the body was found in Indiana, but Jessica had gone missing in Illinois. However, the towns were only about 25 minutes away from one another. So investigators in Indiana were well aware about the missing young girl in the town over. And although they couldn't immediately tell because of decomposition, they feared that it was Jessica Roach. Soon after the discovery of the body, her family was notified, and they waited in agony as it was taken to the medical examiner. Now, during the exam, they learned that the body had been out in the elements for about 2 months, so right around the time that Jessica went missing. They also learned that her decapitation had been after her death, and it could have even occurred from a farmer accidentally driving over her during their harvest. But in terms of how the victim died, they couldn't really tell. But they did know that she had fractured her jaw shortly before her death, possibly from someone punching her, which Larry Hall was known to do to subdue his victims. But days later, they would finally make a positive identification. The body out in the cornfields of Indiana was indeed 15-year-old Jessica Roach. And because her body had been taken across state lines, the case was now in the hands of the FBI.
On November 18th, her body was laid to rest at Georgetown Cemetery, and as the 100-car procession made their way to say their final goodbyes, investigators watched intently. Although Jessica had been found, her killer had not. Whoever was responsible was still on the streets, but soon enough, someone would give the police their first lead. According to a man named Monty Cox, he had been driving through Perrysville, Indiana, on the night that Jessica Roach disappeared. He had just left his shift. It was around 11:30 p.m., and on his way home, he spotted something unusual. It was a man walking out of the cornfields, the very cornfields where Jessica's body had been found. Now, at the time, he thought it was strange, but he just figured that the man had pulled over to use the restroom. However, now, knowing that a young girl's body had been dumped there, he decided to inform the police. And luckily, he even had a description of the man. He said he had dark hair and an odd beard, much like that of Larry Hall. Even further, the man was seen walking towards a dark van. Now, this definitely was a good lead, but without a name, they still had a lot of work to do. Finding a dark-haired man with an odd beard would be like finding a needle in a haystack. And little did they know, their suspect would soon be back in Indiana. On November 19th, Larry found himself in the city of Rochester for a Civil War reenactment. Tourists from all over came to watch him, and no one suspected a thing.
About 5 months later, on May 29, 1994, Larry Hall decided to return to Perrysville, Indiana, the very town where he had dumped Jessica Roach's body. And that's when he spotted another young girl rollerblading in the street near her home. Her name was Amy Baker. Upon seeing her, Gary drove past slowly, but he wanted to get a better look. So, he turned the van around. Now, Amy actually lived near the cornfields where Jessica's body had been dumped. And for Larry, this scenario felt all too familiar. A young girl, all alone, along a rural street. So, he drove past her once again. Amy was well aware of her surroundings, and when she saw the dark van pass her the second time, she immediately knew that something was wrong. Then, she noticed him drive up once more, and this time, he slowed the van down getting far too close for comfort. So Amy started rollerblading down the street as fast as she possibly could. But every time she looked behind her, there he was, following in his van, watching her every move. By this point, he had been driving up and down this road following her for around 10 minutes, so Amy knew that she was in danger. So much so, she even took her roller skates off, thinking she might have to use them to defend herself. But luckily for her, in that very moment, she saw another car coming down the road. She flagged them down and they stopped. She quickly jumped into their car and asked if they could bring her home, and they agreed. And in that moment, the dark van sped off. Amy was really shaken up. She told the Good Samaritan about the man following her and his description: dark bushy hair and mutton chop sideburns. When the driver took her home, Amy immediately ran inside and locked her doors. But to her horror, when she peeked out of her window, there was that creepy van once again driving down the road. So Amy actually wrote down the details of the man and his vehicle. She had even memorized his license plate.
If you love murder in America, you love mysteries, you love true crime, you love murder stories and the unknown, then I have a new show for you. It's called The Conspiracy Files, and it's hosted by me, Colin Browen, from Murder in America and the Paranormal Files. On The Conspiracy Files, we explore everything from bizarre deaths to freak paranormal events, pedophile rings, government corruption, ritual sacrifice. No topic is untouched on this show. Everything that we talk about on The Conspiracy Files is backed up with fact. I release reference sheets with every single episode that we do, so you guys know everything we're talking about is confirmed to have happened and be real. It's a completely different type of show than anything else you've ever seen about conspiracy theories. Instead of a bunch of conjecture and theories, we're presenting you people with facts, telling you the story, walking you through the story just as detailed as we do with Murder in America, and then letting the listener decide what they think. Anyways, you should definitely give it a listen. It's called The Conspiracy Files. The links are in the description of this show, and you can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And now let's get back to our story. Now, that very same day after Larry failed to abduct Amy, he drove back to Georgetown, Illinois, the same town where he had abducted Jessica Roach. He had luck finding a girl there, so why not try again? And this time, he spotted two young girls riding their bikes. It was 13-year-old Abby Mariage and 15-year-old Kaylin Hoskins. Now, the girls were riding near their junior high when they suddenly noticed a dark van following close behind. And just like he did with Amy, he drove past them several times. The girls watched in horror as Larry parked up ahead of them and just sat staring, watching them. Fearing that something wasn't right, the girls decided to go back to Kaylin's house and quickly cut through a back alley down Dyke Street. When they arrived, they told Kaylin's grandmother what had happened and she called the police. And luckily, the girls were able to provide a description: black bushy hair and a thick beard. Abby also called her parents and they arrived to pick her up. But Abby's father, Randy, wanted to find this man. So with Abby in the car, he started driving around. And soon enough, they saw it. It was at a gas station. But it seems as though Larry knew someone was on his trail, because it's here where he quickly sped out of the parking lot. With Randy hot in pursuit, Larry Hall began speeding down the road, zigzagging through traffic at nearly 80 miles per hour. He was clearly trying to get away, but Randy kept up. At a traffic light, Randy pulled up behind the van and jotted down the license plate, 85B3752. And with that, they immediately went to the police.
Finally, they knew the identity of the man who had been stalking young women in the area. His name was Larry Hall. So they put a beat on the lookout for his vehicle, and it wouldn't take them long to find him. In fact, the very next day, Larry's van was spotted in Gas City, Indiana. Officer Neil Pence was the one to pull him over. After Larry rolled down his window, Officer Pence told him that he was going to have to search his vehicle. And Larry seemed nervous. He had every right to be, because as soon as Officer Pence opened up the van, he saw what could only be described as a murder van. There were ropes, knives, plastic tarps, and masks. But the most concerning thing of all were the newspaper articles. Right there on the front page was the name Trisha Reitler, the young college student that went missing the year prior. In addition to this newspaper, he also had a piece of stationery with Trisha's name on it. But sadly, even after these findings, they still didn't have enough evidence to connect him to her murder, so they let him go.
The very day after he was released, on May 31st, 1994, Larry decided to return to his hometown of Wabash, Indiana. But as he was driving through it, he would come across a group of young girls. In the group were Ashley Davis, Tisha Moore, Melissa Selleck, and Danielle Marshall. The girls had been taking a stroll through Wabash City Park when they noticed an odd brown van following them. Larry quickly pulled up beside them and asked if they needed a ride. But these girls must have known that he was dangerous, because they all started running as fast as they possibly could. Luckily, Ashley's house was nearby. Author Christopher Hawley Martin interviewed Tisha in 2009, and she told him the following.
We were walking in the grass near the softball field. I was 11 at the time, and it was creepy the way he drove up beside us and just kept following along. The truck was only moving as fast as we were walking. It just sort of made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. You know there's something wrong with this guy. We started to get scared, and we ran out of the park, down Hill Street, and then up Thorn Street toward Westward School. He was following us, and when we got to Ashley's house, her mother yelled at the man, and he gunned the van out of there.
After seeing the creepy van, Ashley's mother called the police, and the girls were able to provide a description of himself and the vehicle. But Melissa's father, John Selleck, decided to hunt for the van himself. As it turned out, his daughter had actually crossed paths with Larry Hall before. He had tried to pick Melissa up in that same creepy van in the past. So John started driving around, and eventually he found him. But instead of confronting Larry, he simply wrote down the license plate number 85B3752. If this man was going to follow little girls around, then John was going to make sure that the police knew about it. So later that afternoon, the Wabash Police Department showed up at Larry's door, and once again, he was taken in for questioning.
Once back at the police station, Detective Phil Amonis and Detective Jeff Whitmer stepped into an interrogation room, and like many of these interrogations, they started by getting to know Larry. They learned that he participated in Civil War reenactments, and that he often traveled around the Midwest to perform in them. But after a bit of small talk, they started getting into the real questions, specifically about Larry's stalking habits. And surprisingly, Larry started to open up. He told the detectives that every once in a while, when he would be driving down the road, he would slip into these dreamlike states. And the things that would happen during these episodes, well, Larry had a hard time remembering them. He said he would come to, and he would be sitting in his van, confused. When he would look around him, there would be strange items lying nearby. Sometimes he would find women's underwear, car keys, a young girl's bra, but he said he could never remember where they came from. Disturbed, he said he always threw the items away and went on as if nothing happened. Now, following this, the detectives knew that this was a disturbed individual. In fact, after this interview, they even set him up with a therapist. And during Larry's appointment with this therapist, he talked to them about his violent dreams, the ones where he would rape and murder women. After their session, the therapist believed that he suffered from adult antisocial behavior and dream anxiety disorder. Author Christopher Hawley Martin stated, quote, "The doctor reported that Hall was a severely disturbed man with grossly distorted thinking and depersonalized states," end quote. But despite these shocking details, Larry was once again allowed to go free. These dreams that he described weren't necessarily evidence that he was a killer. And although they knew he was disturbed, they didn't have enough to place him under arrest. So once again, he was a free man. And soon enough, he would be back on the streets to look for his next victim. On July 24th, 1994, 13-year-old Natasha Crockett and her younger sister, 10-year-old Nicole, were outside playing across the street from their home at 416 10th Street in Logansport, Indiana. As they ran around a parking lot across the street, the girls noticed an odd van watching them. He was parked a little bit away, but the girls could see that he was writing something down. Then, a few minutes later, the girls saw the van driving in their direction. "Do you girls know where Woodlawn Street is?" he asked them, but the girls had no idea. "Oh, well, that's okay. Do y'all want to hop in and take a drive?" he asked. But immediately, the girls knew that this man was trouble, so they both ran home to tell their parents.
On October 9th, 1994, 20-year-old Carrie Ann Smith's body was found floating down the Tippecanoe River in Rochester, Indiana. Carrie lived at 3325 South Main Street in South Bend and was last seen at that location. Carrie was a known sex worker. An autopsy determined that she had been raped, tortured, sexually mutilated, and then strangled. Investigators had no idea where she had been murdered. There was no evidence on the bridge or on the riverbanks. After Larry Hall's arrest, police discovered a note in his van with the word Menominee. Apparently, the Menominee public access was only 1 mile upstream from where Carrie's body was discovered. Today, investigators believe that Larry paid Carrie for sex to get her into his van.
A few months later, on October 22, 1994, Nicole Brucker was celebrating her 14th birthday at her home in Georgetown, Indiana. Later that evening, Nicole and her friend, 14-year-old Danielle Mullins, decided to walk to the store. But as they made their way down Walnut Street, they suddenly heard a car pull up behind them. When the girls turned around, it was a dark van, and the man inside was someone they didn't recognize. He quickly pulled up beside the girls and asked if they wanted a ride, but they refused and continued walking. However, instead of leaving the girls alone, the man kept following them. Eventually, the girls started running, and they finally made their way back home where they told their parents about what happened. From there, they called the police and gave them a description of the man and his vehicle. And surprise, surprise, it was none other than Larry Hall. Within 6 short months, 11 different girls around the Midwest had reported that Larry's van had been stalking them. And several of these girls had even written down his license plate. So his crimes were gaining some attention. And remember those detectives from Larry's hometown? The one who set him up with that therapist? Well, after Larry Hall had been set free, they couldn't seem to get him off their minds. Larry had admitted that he had these dark and violent dreams of hurting young women, but they had to let him go. However, months later, Sergeant Jeff Whitmer received a random fax from a detective in Georgetown. His name was Gary Miller, and he had worked the unsolved murder of Jessica Roach, the girl who was found murdered after her bike went missing in the middle of the road. Now, Gary Miller had seen that Larry Hall had been involved in these 2 attempted kidnappings, and he was beginning to wonder if he could have been responsible for Jessica's murder. Now, when Jeff Whitmer received this fax, he knew that they were onto something, and he and Gary Miller quickly connected. When they finally talked on the phone, one of the first things he asked Gary was, quote, "Is there a military reenactment in Georgetown?" To which Gary said yes. As it turns out, there had been a Revolutionary War reenactment on September 19, 1993 in Forest Glen Park, which was the day before Jessica went missing. And the location of the reenactment was only 5 miles away from where Jessica went missing. So immediately, the detectives knew that they were onto something. Detective Gary Miller believed that they were finally about to find Jessica's killer. Now, following this, word got around that Larry Hall was a suspect in these abductions and murders of young women around Indiana and Illinois. And the detectives who worked Trisha Reitler's murder, the girl who went missing from campus, began to wonder if he was responsible for her disappearance as well. So from here, all of these detectives started working together. On November 2nd, 1994, they all met up at the Wabash Police Department, where they would finally get to interview Larry Hall. Inside of the interrogation room, detectives took turns questioning him. At first, they noticed he was very soft-spoken and polite. But when they asked about his van being connected in 2 attempted abductions, Larry started to get nervous. At first, he denied being involved, but the detectives had him backed into a corner. "They wrote down your license plate, Larry. How do you explain that?" they asked. Larry became visibly agitated, saying, quote, Well, if I did talk to those girls, it was only because I was trying to be polite. I wasn't trying to kidnap them. But the detectives started to turn up the heat. They could tell that Larry was an insecure man, that he wasn't comfortable around women. So Detective Gary Miller decided to take advantage of that. "Do girls ever laugh at you, Larry?" he asked. Immediately, something was triggered within him. Larry became angry. The detective then placed a picture in front of him. It was a 15-year-old Jessica Roach. "Do you recognize this girl?" he asked. But after one quick glance, Larry pushed his chair back and looked away. He couldn't bring himself to look at the picture. Throughout the remainder of the interview, Larry denied any involvement in the disappearance of Tricia Reitler. He also denied murdering Jessica Roach. But his entire tone would change when the FBI got involved. As mentioned earlier, Jessica Roach had been abducted in Illinois and dumped in Indiana, so she already had FBI agents working her case. And for whatever reason, when they spoke with Larry Hall, he finally confessed to the murder of Jessica Roach. Special Agent Michael Randolph was the one who took his confession, and it read the following.
I recall I was in Illinois for a Revolutionary War reenactment. This was in the fall of 1993. I was in Forest Glen Park, County Park. I stayed that night. I usually sleep in my van. The next day I headed back home to Wabash, Indiana. I was on the road. There was a girl walking a bike. I stopped and talked to her. I had to grab her because she wouldn't have gotten in by herself. I usually keep starting fluid and rags. I might have used these on her, but I don't think I used this on her. I tied her up, but I can't remember with what. I remember taking her pants off. I took my pants off and had sex with her. I can't remember what kind. I laid her up against a tree and put a belt around her neck and she stopped breathing. I was close to a bridge and a river. This is where I had her. There was a road through a cornfield. She was wrapped in tarp while in the van. I took the tarp off and left her in the cornfield. I just do things and I'm not in control. I was shown a picture of Jessica Roach, and this picture looks a little like the girl I remember. I have nightmares where I remember these murders. I write things about the girls and I don't remember when I wrote them. I would find these in the van."
In that last sentence, Larry Hall talked about his journals, where he wrote down notes about the girls he stalked. The police would later find some of these notes with victims' names written on them. Now, disturbingly, Larry also added another detail to his confession. He said that while he was murdering Jessica Roach, she cried for her mother, something that made him angry. He also said that when he was murdering her, he made sure to do it against a tree so he didn't have to look at her face, which is something he would do when he murdered women. He would later say, quote, "I can't see their faces, but I can hear their screams," end quote. And in this next part, he also confesses to the murder of Tricia Reitler, the college student who he attacked. The confession continues with the following.
In late March '93, I was in Marion, Indiana several times. I don't remember where in Marion. It was near some homes and gas station. There was a small shopping center. I had a van. There was possibly a struggle with her to get in the van. I do remember she tried to run away. I ran towards her, ran into her, and we fell to the ground. I told her I was not going to hurt her and to calm down. She would not calm down and tried to get away. I had a knife to scare her. I made her sit on the ground and take her clothes off. It was dark. There was a dark-colored dog there. When taking her clothes off, she tried to run again. I shoved her down and told her I didn't want to hurt her. She took everything but underclothes off. I remember putting her on a tarp or canvas. I think she was alive. She just laid there. I didn't have sex with her there. I put her in the van and put a bag of trash on her. I drove a couple of hours. I first drove southwest and then just kept driving and turning. I got lost. I don't remember taking her out of the van, but I recall being on a canvas in the woods having sex. I set her up against a tree and put a belt around her neck. I left her, possibly left her near a creek and a concrete bridge. I was shown a picture of Tricia Reitler, and I thought the Xerox photo on the flyer looked like her.
Now later on, Larry would actually lead detectives to the location of where he left Tricia's body. But sadly, when they went there, Tricia wasn't there. And to this day, her body has never been found. But Jessica and Tricia weren't the only murders that Larry confessed to. In his confession, he continued by saying the following.
All the girls looked alike. I can't remember all of them. I went to Anderson, Indiana, and exactly the same thing happened. This was in 1992. I got a girl in Anderson. I can't remember details now. I picked up several girls in other areas, but I can't remember which ones I hurt. I went to a car show in Indianapolis, July or probably August 1994. I picked up a girl. I can't remember the recent girls I picked up. This girl was in Indianapolis and was a brunette. It was Clermont. I remember this girl didn't want to go with me and I had to force her. I've gone to Wisconsin to reenactments there. Last time was a year or so before.
So as you just heard, Larry Hall was coming clean about everything. He had been victimizing young women in these Midwestern towns for years. And unfortunately, he claimed he couldn't remember a lot of the details surrounding the murders. So the FBI had the daunting task of trying to figure out which murders were the work of Larry Hall.
In the meantime, he was finally arrested and sent to the Grant County Jail in Marion, Indiana, while he waited for extradition to Illinois. But before that, Larry Hall recanted his confession. He said that what he told investigators that day was simply what he remembered from those dark dreams he would have. They weren't actual memories, he said.
So from here, investigators had a big problem on their hands. At the end of the day, they didn't have any physical evidence linking Larry to the murders. Just his confession that he recanted. Now, investigators did get a search warrant for his van, and inside, they found newspaper clippings from Jessica Roach's murder and from Trisha Reitler's disappearance. Under the carpet of his van, they also discovered cryptic notes that he would write himself, notes that would keep him out of trouble. They read things like, "No body contact, buy condoms, buy 2 more leather belts." Other notes read, quote, "Seen joggers and bikers, many alone, check colleges, parks, seen some prospects." In other journal entries, he wrote to-do lists that read, quote, "Get van ready, put curtains in windows, change license plate, buy 2 more plastic tarps, cover all floors and sides of van." Disturbingly, they also found a pornographic picture. Now, the picture was not of Jessica Roach, but it had her name on it. He also altered the picture. He had drawn a rope around her neck, and he colored some blood coming out of the girl's mouth. Now, when his van was searched, investigators weren't able to find anything that could link him to their victims. No DNA, no fingerprints, blood, hair, clothing fibers, nothing. But based on Larry's to-do lists, it seemed as though he was meticulous about cleaning up after his crimes.
This was definitely considered a loss for investigators. Not only did they not find any evidence, but Larry Hall had recanted his confession. He said he had planted all that stuff in his van for attention.
I put a bunch of stuff in that van that I drove around with because I knew they'd eventually search my van and find them.
But even so, they did have enough to place him under arrest for his part in the abduction of Jessica Roach. And on December 21st, 1994, Larry Hall was charged with 1 count of kidnapping for the purposes of sexual gratification. And 6 months later, on June 6, 1995, Larry was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now, while in jail, the bodies of 4 Jane Does were found around the Midwest. And based on their levels of decomposition, investigators theorized that they were all murdered before Larry Hall had been arrested. And he's actually a suspect in all 4 of those cases. But today, they remain unsolved.
In February of 1996, Larry's attorney, Craig H. DeArmond, argued for a new trial. You see, during Jessica Roach's trial, some of Larry's other crimes had been mentioned. And because of that, his defense didn't think he had a fair trial. So in August of 1998, he was granted a new one. Jessica's family thought their nightmare was over, but it wasn't. And they had to go through the entire process again. This time around, Larry's attorney really hammered down on the fact that he had given a false confession. According to him, Larry wasn't an actual killer. He was a wannabe killer. He wanted to feel important. He wanted attention, so he confessed. They also brought forward a clinical psychologist who told the jury that Larry suffered from multiple personality disorders and he had a low IQ of 80. and that those qualities could make him susceptible to a false confession. His attorneys also focused on the fact that there was no evidence linking him to the crime, and that the items found in his van were merely circumstantial. But remember that eyewitness, Monty Cox? Well, he testified that Larry Hall was indeed the man he saw emerging from that cornfield on the night of Jessica's disappearance. And he was confident that it was Larry. After all, Larry had a very distinct look due to his bushy sideburns. And this next part wasn't mentioned at trial, but all of the girls who had escaped Larry Hall recalled that same thing, his dark van and his bushy sideburns. To investigators and the prosecution, they knew that they had the right guy, but it wasn't up to them. It was up to the jury. And after 4 hours of deliberation, they once again found Larry Hall guilty.
On December 2nd, 1997, Larry stood before Judge Joe B. McDade in Peoria, Illinois. Behind the defense table, Larry stood and made a statement to the court. He said, quote,
I just wanted to say that all 35 years of my life, I've known the full value of every human life, every animal life on this earth, and that I've never in any way harmed Jessica Roach or any other poor, helpless young girl, and that I hate and despise people who do harm to people that can't defend themselves. And I have never in my life actually hurt anyone. And I pray to God someday you'll know that that's true and won't just have to accept my word for it. I pray to God that the word will come out eventually, that I had nothing to do with this crime, and that the confession, as they call it, from start to finish is totally fictitious and never happened. I did not kidnap Jessica Roach off her new bicycle. I'm not that kind of person. And God help me, I pray that I'll be able to prove it someday.
End quote. In turn, U.S. Attorney Lawrence Beaumont read a poem that Jessica Roach's family had written after her murder. Quote,
We lost a great deal, now it's sorrow we feel. We tried to find you when you were lost. If I could change what happened, I would at any cost. At least you now feel no pain, and one day we'll see you alive again. But if only good things I keep stressing, I will try to be God impressing. I hope to be in this earthly paradise, because then the dead will rise. I'm sure you will too. What God wanted, you tried to do.
Ultimately, Larry Hall was once again sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Finally, after 5 long years, Jessica's family could put this nightmare behind them and do their best to heal. Patricia Reitler's family was still in the midst of their nightmare. After she had been abducted near her university, they never got any answers. They never got to bring her home. Larry Hall had confessed to killing Trisha, and he even told investigators where he had dumped her body, but then he recanted, and Trisha's body wasn't where he said it would be. Now, to some people, this meant that Larry wasn't actually her killer, but Trisha's family still believed that he was involved, and so did investigators. So, they hatched a plan. They were going to find a confidential informant, someone that would befriend Larry in prison, and hopefully through that friendship, Larry would confess about his other crimes.
The confidential informant was a man named Jimmy Keene. He had been convicted in 1997 of conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and from there, he was sentenced to 10 years in a minimum security prison. But in 1998, after serving only 10 months of his sentence, Jimmy was approached by U.S. Attorney Lawrence Beaumont. During their meeting, Beaumont pushed a large folder across the table, and when Jimmy opened it up, he was shocked to see the dead, mutilated body of a young girl. It was Jessica Roach. As Jimmy continued flipping through the pages, he found a picture of Trisha Reitler. Beaumont told Jimmy that Trisha had likely been killed by a suspected serial killer named Larry Hall, and that they needed his help. They told Jimmy that they wanted to transfer him to Larry's prison. Once there, he would befriend him, and if Jimmy could get Larry to tell them the whereabouts of Trisha Reitler's body, then they would let Jimmy walk free with a clean criminal record. However, if he failed, there would be no early release. Now, this wasn't an easy decision. Larry was at a maximum security prison with mentally ill and violent offenders, but Jimmy still had 9 years left of his sentence, and his father was growing older. In his novel, In With the Devil, Jimmy wrote, quote,
All I had in my mind was that vision of my father slumped in the wheelchair. I couldn't concentrate on the serial killer stuff or anything else, but finally I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about him too. I had to do everything in my power to get out of prison as soon as I could.
End quote. So ultimately, Jimmy accepted the offer. Now, after being transferred to Larry's prison, Jimmy was instructed to be patient. Larry Hall was a very introverted man who didn't have a lot of friends, so he couldn't just walk up and start asking him questions right away. In fact, Jimmy was told to wait 6 whole months before he even approached Larry, but Jimmy didn't want to wait that long. So, not long after he was transferred, he pretended to bump into Larry on his way out of the cafeteria. At first, Larry was on edge, but Jimmy quickly apologized. He told Larry that he was new to prison and that he needed help finding the library. And luckily, Larry took the bait. Together, they walked to the library. Once there, Jimmy thanked Larry for being cool. And according to Jimmy, Larry responded, "You think I'm cool?" That was never an adjective people used when describing Larry Hall. And this would mark the start of their little pseudo-friendship. Over the next few weeks, Jimmy continued to strike up conversations with Larry Hall. And eventually, Larry asked Jimmy to have breakfast with him and the group of inmates he hung out with. Now, Larry's group in the prison was referred to as baby killers, and they were all the social outcasts. One of the men had taken a chainsaw and killed his entire family, and another had murdered 2 young girls. And then there was Larry, who also killed young girls. So Jimmy wasn't excited to have breakfast with them, but he had to. And slowly over time, he began to earn Larry's trust.
Each time that Jimmy hung out with Larry, he got to know a little bit more about him, about his childhood, his interests, and his life in Indiana. Then one day, Larry asked Jimmy if he wanted to watch America's Most Wanted with him. It was one of Larry's favorite shows, and apparently they played it in prison. So that day, Jimmy watched it, and he couldn't help but notice how fascinated Larry became. He would later say, quote, "It was like Larry was in his own little world. That screen was all he could see." Eventually, watching America's Most Wanted became a part of their routine. Every Saturday night, the baby killers would get together and turn it on. But on one of these occasions, one of the inmates didn't want to watch it, so they stood up and turned it off. Jimmy said that he heard Larry mumble something under his breath, something along the lines of, "I was watching that." So Jimmy decided that this was his opportunity to gain Larry's trust. He quickly stood up, pushed the chairs aside in front of him, and clicked the television back on. And from there, he started a fight with the inmate who turned it off. Now Jimmy would end up getting in some trouble for this scuffle, but it was worth it. Because in Larry Hall's mind, Jimmy had stuck up for him. He was his friend, a friend that he trusted.
About 4 months into his transfer, Jimmy and Larry were spending nearly every day together. And up until this point, Larry wasn't comfortable discussing his crimes. But on this day, he finally admitted that he had been convicted of killing a young girl named Jessica Roach. Larry told Jimmy that he had been in the Georgetown area for a reenactment. And while there, he spotted the 15-year-old pushing her bike down the road. So he pulled over and asked if she needed any help. Now, Larry made sure to point out that Jessica wanted to talk to him, and that she willingly got into the van. But when he tried to kiss her, she began to freak out. So, using a chloroform rag, he placed it over her face. From here, Larry said that he tied her up in the back of the van and drove to a remote location. When Jimmy asked if he had sex with her, he responded,
I kind of had a blackout, and then it was like a dream, and I see myself beating on her and using the rag on her. Then I wake up and her clothes are off and my clothes are off. So I think we had sex together.
Larry said that once Jessica came to, she started crying for her mom. But Larry didn't like that, so he forced her out of the van and made her sit against a tree. Jimmy admitted, quote, "He showed me with his fingers how he would interlock the 2 leather belts. He then got behind the tree so he wouldn't have to see her face. He whipped the belts around her neck and used a stick to twist them like a tourniquet and kept turning and turning until he didn't hear her make another sound." End quote. At last, Jimmy had finally heard a confession, but it wasn't enough. Larry had already been convicted of Jessica's murder. Jimmy needed to hear the details of Trisha Reitler's murder if he wanted to get out of prison early. So he let a few weeks pass, not wanting to raise any suspicion. And then finally, when the time was right, he asked him, "Whatever happened to that Reitler girl?" And once again, Larry opened up. He told Jimmy that on the night in question, he had approached Trisha as she was leaving the grocery store. Now, once again, Larry lied, saying that Trisha willingly got into his van. Like with Jessica, he said that everything was going fine until he made a move on her. And once he did that, Larry said that Trisha started screaming, kicking, and punching him. So from there, he wrapped his hands around her neck to make her stop. But he said that once the violence started, he blacked out again, going into that dreamlike state. And when he came to, he and Trisha were both naked in the back of his van. However, by then, Trisha was unconscious, and when he went to check for a pulse, there was none. So not knowing what to do, he drove back home to Wabash, leaving Trisha's dead body in the back of the van. According to Larry, he buried her that night, somewhere far out in the country, and to conceal her body even further, he said he used a bag of lime.
But sadly, Larry wouldn't reveal where Trisha was located. However, a few weeks later, Jimmy said that he walked into the prison workshop where he saw Larry looking at a map with all these red dots over locations in Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. But when Jimmy walked over, Larry quickly closed the map and pushed it off to the side. Jimmy believed that the map showed the locations of where Larry's victims were buried, but he wasn't able to get a hold of it. And soon after this, Jimmy and Larry actually got into an altercation, during which Jimmy told Larry he was a piece of shit for killing those young girls. And from then on, their relationship was over, and Jimmy's time as an informant had come to an end. Now, even though he wasn't able to help investigators find Trisha's body, he did get Larry to confess to Trisha's murder. He didn't get it on recording or anything, but investigators gave him a polygraph regarding all the information he had received from Larry, and he passed. So, on February 24th, 1999, U.S. Attorney Beaumont urged a federal judge to give Jimmy credit for time served, and he was allowed to leave prison a free man. He even got to spend another 5 years with his father until his death in 2004. But sadly, their operation didn't go as planned, and to this day, the body of Trisha Reitler has never been found. However, her parents, Gary and Donna Reitler, still cling to hope that one day they will have answers. Here's what they told CNN in their special report to catch a serial killer.
There's a parent, there's the part that you've let her down and that you want to find her and you want to bring her home and you can't.
This case is a frustrating one with so many unanswered questions. Then, to add even more mystery, in 2010, an Indianapolis cold case investigator met with Larry. They had suspected him in some other murders around Indiana, and they wanted to ask him some questions. And to their surprise, when they sat down with Larry Hall, he confessed to 14 other murders that took place in the states of Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, California, Colorado, Missouri, and Wyoming. At that moment, investigators believed that they were finally going to get some answers in these cold cases. However, of course, Larry would later recant these confessions. So technically, in the eyes of the law, Larry Hall has only been convicted of kidnapping Jessica Roach in 1993. However, many people believe that he has many more victims. His own twin brother, Gary Hall, even told CNN that he has no doubt in his mind that Larry is a serial killer. In 2011, Larry himself actually spoke to the Associated Press, where he admitted that he had abducted 39 women from 1980 to 1994. But because he committed these crimes while he was quote-unquote blacked out, and in this dreamlike state, he can't recall many details. Now, if that's true, then that makes him one of the most deadly serial killers in America. However, there are other people out there who believe that Larry Hall is all talk, that he exaggerated the amount of victims he had because of his own insecurities. But one thing we know for sure, no matter how many victims he had, Larry Hall was weak. He would spend his weekends partaking in these Civil War reenactments, pretending to kill soldiers on a field in front of an audience. It seemed to have given him this dark confidence, something he didn't possess in his real life. Then, after the battle was over, he'd take off his uniform and he'd wreak havoc on whatever town he was in. However, unlike the soldiers on the field, his victims were young girls. They were much smaller than him, They were vulnerable, and they didn't have weapons to fight back.
Today, Larry Hall is serving out his life sentence in the Federal Correctional Complex Butner in North Carolina. He will remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. And in honor of today's episode, we will be making a donation to Night Owl Reconnaissance, a nonprofit organization that searches for missing people and provides support for families. Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Murder in America. If you are interested in this story, Apple TV actually created a very good miniseries called Blackbird about that informant operation. It's a really great miniseries. It's very well acted, very well shot. So if you want to see kind of the intricacies of what happened inside of the prison, it's very interesting. I would highly recommend you go check that out. If you love Murder in America and you want to help us do what we do and help support the show, please consider joining us over on Patreon. We have an amazing community over on Patreon. And if you join us on there, you can get access to a number of awesome things. You can get early access to the episodes without the ads in them if you don't like the ads. And additionally, there are bonus episodes that are only going to be on Patreon. They are full episodes of Murder in America, just like the ones you listen to here on the main feed. We drop multiple every single month. So if you like the show and you want to help us continue doing what we do, please consider joining us there. And thank you to everybody in the past who already has. As always, follow us on Instagram at Murder in America to see photos from every single case that we cover. And be sure to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this show. Anyways, y'all, thank you so much for tuning in. Courtney and I hope everybody has an absolutely incredible weekend, and I'll catch y'all on the next one.
Today's episode is presented by Mimics, a blend of horror, fun, and romance. From the mind of Christopher Palaha, down on his luck impressionist Sam Reinhold makes a pact with Fergus, a wicked, strings-attached puppet that holds the promise to propel Sam to stardom, unleashing a nightmare that threatens the safety of those he holds dear. Hot off its electrifying premiere at the Cordillera International Film Festival, watch the first trailer at mimicsmovie.com. And don't miss this genre-bending event when it hits theaters on February 6th, 2026. Who's the dummy now?